A decentralized, there is, if you think about a decentralized organization, there is no decentralized organization. If you want decentralized, like if you, something is decentralized fully, then it's complete chaos. First of all, it's always a spectrum, and the idea behind the organizational model is that it's malleable, so you can influence what you want to centralize and what you want to decentralize. Autonomous, any organization is autonomous because any organization is floating around making decisions together. So the point here, how do you call it, dissected correctly, is that the organization is made up of autonomous parts, and that any part can be excluded at any point in time.
Welcome everybody to the Click podcast, where this is your safe space for all things DAO ops related. This is a space where when you look at the DAO world outside, it's hard to keep up on your own. Here with our bunch of contributors and guests who've done a phenomenal job traversing the frontier of what we consider to be DAO ops, you now get your alpha and your operational insights. I'm your co-host Abhishek Ajit, and along with me is my co-host Abhishek Sonavne. Hi Abhishek, how are you doing?
Hey man, all good. How are you?
All right, doing fantastic, man. Just looking forward to this episode. And with me is the founder of a team that I really look up to. A couple of months back, I had just been listening to something regarding organizational design while I was making an article about the contributor economy. And the insights that this team had was really an eye opener. And it was a pleasant surprise when my co host got all of us together to make this podcast happen. We now have Andrej Berlin, who is the founder of DeepWork Studios, which is a decentralized design studio. And they also have some radical ideas for organizational design that we are here to explore today. Hi, Andrej. How are you doing?
Hello. Thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you so much for the intro. Yeah, I'm great.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pleasure having you here and very eager to explore the sort of ideas that we're here to talk about. Before we get to that, let's start things off on a light note. How did you get acquainted with this space, and what was your background and your inspiration for launching studios?
Good question. Yeah. I have worked before starting DeepWork as a designer and user researcher, prototyper, I guess. I tried to back then find a good job description. I think creative technologist was probably the most suitable one. I worked at an agency called AJ and Smart here in Berlin, and a lot of that was based on self-learning. So we were started off as a web design agency, but then over time transitioned into helping teams and companies here in the city build out their businesses and build out their products by creating like very user-focused experiences, digital experiences, user testing them, and also doing that very collaboratively. So we got inspired a lot by Google Ventures, or now called GV's frameworks, in particular Jake Knapp's Sprint. And a lot of the things that he has been writing about were a lot of it was about getting people in a room together to ideate and come up with really good product ideas very quickly, and also prototype them. So we applied a lot of the principles that he was writing about, and back then it was everything in an office, and I also liked traveling, and I thought that it would be cool if we could like somehow figure out a way to transfer this powerful process and this kind of amazing experience to sit together in one room and come up with really wild ideas and prototype them and play with them and make them financially sustainable. If we could also turn that into a remote experience. And then I found that the Web3 space, that was like 2016, 17, which has been slowly glowing up, was focused a lot around the technology. And there was a lot of money streamed into Web3. Although money wasn't really my biggest concern or focus, it was more that I saw the need of these technical teams, that they can write code together. There are enough tools, and there's GitHub to write code together, but there are no tools and no principles to actually design together. And yeah, so all of these things, along with like then another year that I spent just not working at an agency, but focusing on my personal health, all of these things gave conception to what is now DeepWork Studio. And along with meeting my co-founder, Charlie, of course, who helped a lot with setting up the financial infrastructure, making sure everything we do is legal, and yeah, doing payroll properly and all these things.
Fantastic. For once, I'm happy to hear a positive story about how focusing on one's health and doing things in a sustainable way led to something really solid out there. People burn out and they take a long time to do that. But here you explored your passions, you focused on your health, and you decided to focus on something that you cared about passionately to build this sort of a pretty innovative team that's working on the frontier of something pretty exciting. Now that you've gotten to the part of how you found your co-founder and built DeepWork Studios, for people who may not know what DeepWork Studio is all about, could you just get into the heart of what DeepWork Studio is all about and the sort of work you're passionate about and have achieved?
Yeah, of course. So DeepWork Studio is basically a product design studio, product and like now also brand and visual identity design studio. And yeah, it came essentially from us, from working in a creative studio and designing products like apps or digital products on the screen. Although we also design like physical stuff and VR apps and everything. And didn't get to that yet in the Web3 space, but for the most part, DeepWork Studio is designing products for the Web3 ecosystem. So whether it's for DeFi or for reputation-based stuff, or if it's something like, yeah, even project management tools. But yeah, I would say that most of the projects are actually focused on DeFi just because that's where the most of the innovation currently lies, although we're slowly transitioning into a lot of other areas. Also, like this development and in general, like building out infrastructure, a lot of tools that help build out social infrastructure. So yeah, so that's kind of it. Yeah, I think also mention worthy is that to the outside, it looks like a design studio, but on the inside, it's actually a collective of freelancers intentionally designed in a way that there are no long-term contracts. So we wanted people to just do whatever they want to do and then find ways of combining their interests in doing things together. So most like everything's project based. And if we have a client project, we have a very specific criteria and specific workflows on how we approach it. And then we have a network of individuals who have proven to each other that they can take on a very specific role in that kind of a project. And they aggregate around these projects, solve them, get paid, and then they disperse and do other things as well. And everything in the organization is like that. There's also internal projects, so things that are operations or finance or even social media awareness is very project based.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's intriguing that you operate out of this sort of a structure. You can mention that you're an ONC, you're a collective of things. Even in the sort of documentation, you call yourself to be an ONC, when everybody, even people, even these so-called crypto protocols call themselves DAOs when they are not. It's so fancy to get that DAO label out there. You don't want to associate yourself with the DAO thing. You want to call yourself an ONC. You want that sort of decentralized label on that. So for people who are not aware with what an ONC is, could you get into what an ONC is and why you prefer to be called by an ONC and how is it different from the whole DAO structure?
Yeah, of course. Eventually, I will not be able to influence how people will call things. I think I don't know which direction it will go. I might not be able to influence how people will call DeepWork. A lot of people call it a DAO, and again, like I'm not going to influence them. And it's fine. I just like thinking about terms and words that I use myself, and calling something a decentralized autonomous organization sounds more. This is a quote from one of my mentors. It sounds more like a combination. It's a buzzword that's a combination made of other buzzwords. Because if you think about a decentralized organization, there is no decentralized organization. If you want decentralized, like something is decentralized fully, then it's complete chaos. First of all, it's always a spectrum, and the idea behind the organizational model is that it's malleable, so you can influence what you want to centralize and what you want to decentralize. Autonomous, any organization is autonomous because any organization is floating around making decisions together. So the point here is about that, or like how do you call it, dissect it correctly, is that the organization is made up of autonomous parts, and that any part can be excluded at any point in time. And obviously, organization also presupposes that something is being organized around something else, or that there is some kind of value structure. And we don't see that in the DeFi space. There is no production of value that's apparent, it's in the focus. There's no organization. There's a Discord channel and a snapshot. And what else do we have? A token.
No, so safe.
And yeah, exactly. And a multi-sig, right? But these are tools, these are means to the end. So I thought about how I would call DeepWork, and I think that DeepWork more is, you could describe it as an online, like an ONC, an online native cooperative, because it's online native. We all grew up with the internet and we know how to use it, and we have learned our way into being part of it. And the cooperative kind of, we're working together. We're actually cooperating in specific parts. And then what parts are decentralized, what are centralized, that's already a matter of detail. By the way, DAOs, or like the terminology of DAO, that's been around for about 50 years. There's a great researcher called Stafford Bear. He wrote about a model called Viable System Model. I really recommend Googling that and reading articles from Block Science written by Kelsey Nabin, but also other folks from Block Science. Really great work. And that's probably the best lens you can get on how an organization can be flexible, but also like fractalizable and very resilient.
We'll be happy to share that in the description.
Yeah,
I think 90% of the people in the DAO space would not know that the term has been in existence for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's news to me also, actually.
Yeah.
But that kind of begs the question. Now that we are coming back to this whole cycle of how DAO should be viewed, why did you take this approach of sticking to this model? What has this sort of model given you that probably taking the approach of a startup or going the DAO with the gnosis safe and things like that? These are two extreme spectrums, and you've consciously chosen to take like a pragmatic way of dealing with your team. What has that given you in terms of execution and in terms of discovering ideas?
Yeah, a good question. I think I would always think about concepts and new things and cool things as a noticeable part of an evolution that always resides in solving particular problems. So the way that DeepWork is designed is basically as a consequence of looking for ways to fix a lot of different problems with tools that we have available. And one of the things that we started was with health. So it's very health first. So we looked at, for example, how do you design a working day that allows you to live your life? So a working day would not be longer, especially for highly cognitively demanding work, would not be longer than 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours. That's the max you can do. So we had to find a way to validate that as possible. And with the design sprints and with the sprint process, especially remotely, we were able to schedule invites throughout the day, but also throughout the week, so that they're still shorter than what any other agency would offer, higher value than any other agency would offer, because we had the skills, and also the days were shorter. So that's one of the first criteria. And then another thing that I would say that I noticed, like nowadays, a lot more as diverging different types of organizations, is the way you communicate. Everything is also truth first. If something feels like you would have to say something that's not quite, or let's say truth second, or I don't know, both of them are important. But truth is extremely important, and not only because you don't want to lie to people and set wrong expectations, but by talking, by speaking out the truth about what you think is right, you also learn to be a lot more in touch with reality, with what's really happening. You learn really quickly when what you say actually resonates or it doesn't. And that has a huge impact on how you will want to design anything. For DeepWork, we were like basically starting off as an agency, as like a duo of two freelancers. And then we needed to scale. And obviously the truth part is very granular, it's all over the place, but I'm more describing the problems that we had to solve throughout this scaling process. So we had to hire someone, for example, and then we realized we are in DeFi, or sorry, not in DeFi, but we are in like crypto, and everything's in ups and downs. We have no influence about the market. So if we hire someone on a payroll, two freelancers can't afford paying someone else to just stick around, get paid whether it does work or not. So we had to keep the model of everybody having to be a freelancer and only coming on projects when they can. Then, so we started with that. Then we had a phase where we needed to replicate. So we needed to teach people, or actually just hire more people, because we had so much demand. And then we trusted some people that we knew, and they were like, yeah, of course, I can do user research. We put them on a project, and then they could not do it, or they did not deliver a good result, or they were just not very polite to the clients sometimes. And so we realized, okay, it's not that person is bad or like doing something wrong. It's just that we haven't specified the criteria and we haven't like actually watch them do it and learn it. So taking experience from also creating online courses, we basically made education a big part of the actual kind of systemic property of the organization, so that if you want to work, you have to learn how to work, and you don't just learn it by yourself. You need a mentor. So you have someone else look over your shoulder and make sure that you can do it. And then obviously we were looking into, or like I was interested more also in kind of the technology of Web3 and like immutable public records and self-sovereign identity and things like those, and the use cases of that, and that they have the potential to actually make that little social network also scalable, because you could say between the two of us, I can verify that you can follow this workflow, but someone else who is a friend of my friend, who might also be part of the network, he doesn't know that we had that conversation. And so out of that, the idea of these credentials emerged, where we basically watch people over the shoulder, see if they can follow a very specific workflow, which is public. And if they can do it, then they receive an attestation, and then everybody else can see, yes, they have that attestation. They can follow that workflow at DeepWork. Yes, I know DeepWork, I know the case studies of DeepWork, and then I can trust that person to work on my project too. So yeah, there's a lot of these small little problems, and I think that, yeah, also one of the things I learned is that everything about creativity is just about problem solving. You find a problem and you solve it, and then you're a tiny step further.
No, I find it really fascinating that, Abhishek, if you've noticed now, a lot of the ideas that he's implemented at DeepWork Studios, they are actually a lot of the DAO ideas that you see about reputation models, about kind of having that sort of education for their own communities. DeepWork Studios has already implemented it to some degree from their kind of bad experiences with clients. And that's really fascinating. You guys are like way ahead of the curve on that. Now, because we just did a couple of episodes with Marco Grendel from Polygon DAO and Ayan about how reputation can be a key to scaling, and a lot of DAOs are experimenting with that. They've not even touched the surface, and you guys have already gone and implemented it, and that's pretty cool.
I think, Abhishek, at this point, Andre, I think there was an interesting project that was started by DeepWork that was called Deep Skills. So do you want to talk about that? Because I've been following that for quite some time now.
Yeah, cool. Nice. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. I can talk about these things for hours as well. One of the, I think, unique principles, because of which I would attribute to what you just mentioned about being ahead of the curve, that we already implemented it, is that we're just very good at researching existing tools and applying them to a degree that solves the problem at the scale that we currently have. And so over the last years, we basically prototyped ourselves through most of these problems in a very small scale and an observable scale, but that gave us the experience of observing how humans actually interact in that kind of network that has never existed before. And so we used like Notion, Typeform, Zap, and like obviously Discord to connect all these things together and create almost, with Typeform, you have a user interface. With Zapier, you connect the input to another document or Discord. And then you see people follow through and use these things any way you want. And at some point, we reached a point where we realized, okay, if we still have a lot of demand for design work, but there's also an incredible demand for that organizational framework, because the world is changing, for basically any type of work. And we decided to use the profits and the profit margin that we had from design projects basically to reinvest into upgrading this no-code infrastructure into something that is more custom built. So far, the tools are mostly based on Web 2. So we have one app that's called Deep Skills under app.deepskills.io, which is essentially the next layer of automation of the entire no-code infrastructure. And it covers kind of all these principles that I've been talking about. So you can create an organization. That organization has very specific roles. You can describe what these roles consist of. And then you can set up projects utilizing these roles. And then you have people fill these roles, complete the project. And if they fill these roles and if they complete the work successfully to the project owner's happiness or to each other's happiness, then they receive an attestation on their profile. And that's the Web 2 version. It's very easy to like look and click through it and understand it. And it works for a larger amount of people, which I would expect to use it over the next months or so. and expanded to a few other organizations. I'm already playing around with other projects that I'm just setting up there just for fun. And the next layer is going to be Web3. And Web3 is in particular kind of an automation of the software because it helps scale the demand and the current infrastructure to essentially a global level while retaining its flexibility. So a lot of the purposes of designing it that way and implementing it was about being as resilient and as flexible as possible at any point in time. Therefore, also like freelancers doing what they want. And so Deep Skills is, we're currently like incubating it, like building smaller things. We have also workshops that are more for organizational design, or we facilitate them with teams. We're actually right now, we're like at this moment, there's a workshop, a DAO Incubator with 3 teams from Cello that's currently run. And so we're basically like, helping people adopt this mental framework. And then we can also provide them with the software to actually keep coordinating around that.
Yeah, so I find that fascinating, the sort of thing. I want to get into the organizational design part, but I have this question about deep skills in general. A lot of the things that DAOs kind of issues that they have when it comes to credentialing is that you have a lot of communities that are, what to say, they are bound by how their culture operates. And the sort of work that they do, it's also pretty frontier tech. The sort of standardization that you see with credentialing in Web 2, it's very different across DAOs today. So, what is your recommendation for DAOs to provide the right credentials that freelancers or anybody who wants to contribute can really value, and it has, what to say, global exposure across the ecosystem as well?
Yeah, good question. I think the very first thing that people and teams should focus on is aligning on what they want to do. So that's the very first thing. Let's say you're a team and you're just like excited about some idea, but you don't exactly know what's behind it. Just find like proper alignment, put things into writing. What are your values? What's your goal? What's your like mission with what you would like to do? What's the purpose of you just working together? And then the other thing is to start focusing on creating value. So where can you create value as a unique combination of skills that nobody else can do? And who would that be for? So you would always, you'll have to look into what your past experience is and maybe write some autobiographies to figure out like what you're actually good at. I can recommend Jordan Peterson's self-authoring suite. No affiliation, but a really great tool to just get clarity over what you're doing individually. And I think the same applies to the team. So you write down things that you were good at in the past, and then you find ways to make use of them. And so find ways that you can create value. Who can you create value for? And then things will fall into place. Like then you can think about how can we make that more efficient? Or let's say, how can we create more value for as many people as possible? And that should be the driver for actually using tools. I get a lot of requests from people who reach out to me and they ask me, hey, I'm doing this, like, I want to create this cool Web3 online course. What do you recommend me to do? Like this, I'm going to create a DAO and then we're going to create a token. And I'm like, first of all, think about why do you want to create an online course? Because there's so many of them. This is just an example. But to look at like, why do you want to do these things? And don't get excited about the technology, but get excited about the problem that you're trying to solve, because the problem is going to be about the people. A lot of teams are excited about seeing the technology or imagining that a cool future with that technology could look like, but that's very misleading because it's very short-lived. And of course, it's nice to dream about cool technology that can automate things and make your life better, but usually you need a lot more validation from your environment and from other people that, that technology is actually useful. Otherwise, you're not going to create anything that's going to be sustainable.
Absolutely. You just look at what's going on in the ecosystem, you understand people who want to contribute, and you figure out what sort of value should be catered to, and everything will fall into place to set up either the right products or the sort of credentials that matter to people to contribute for the space. In that sense, it makes a lot of sense to me. Now, coming to the topic that you were here for, the organizational design part, you mentioned that you've done organizational design for 3 teams working with Cello, and also a lot of your inspiration for kind of not going for the DAO route itself makes me feel that the way DAOs operate right now is not ideal from a decentralized standpoint, neither is it ideal from an impact or from a work culture standpoint. That's the sort of feeling I get. The way DAOs are organized, that
Mhm.
organizational design part,
Yeah.
are they doing it correctly or not? If not, could you get into why?
Also, very good question and good observation. I don't think they focus on design or organizational design at all. I don't see it, at least. It makes sense because, again, this is a very kind of tech-driven ecosystem still. And I think most of the cool ideas actually come from people outside of the ecosystem that just realize, hey, this something cool is possible. Let's make that work. So most of the DAOs are not focusing on that. And the way that I have seen people essentially understand DAOs as more as a collective that makes decisions, as a small collective, not one that's very large, a small group of individuals that actually make decisions on funding for certain purposes. So a more modern version of VC funding. And I think that they don't really, they don't focus really on organizational design because most of the tools are not or have not been really accessible to them. So most of the organizational infrastructure or operational infrastructure that I can see still relies heavily on legacy infrastructure. So either companies, startups, and like legal setups that are just very inflexible, or on basically no legal infrastructure at all, which is also very dangerous, which we could see on Tornado Cash. So I think there's going to be a lot more of these cases where policymakers are going to pay attention to like how people deal with crypto and who is responsible for what. I think it's not a new problem. Like even in times of the like dot-com bubble, or if you look at Apple, for example, Apple has become so like prominent also in part because of the kind of design ontology. They were really good at thinking about what people actually need and design it for that. And you can see that also on the organizational infrastructure. Of course, given the capabilities that they had, or like the infrastructure and the laws that they were under, they weren't able to adopt a better or a different model, but at least they reached very global, basically a global scale in terms of the reach of their product. And I think that focusing in particular or on designing experiences within the organization, almost like a human network, or I guess a human system design. I had a conversation with a friend recently and we discussed this kind of idea of a human systems design. There's human computer interaction, human system interaction design. So there's human computer design interaction, and then human system interaction, where you're still designing experience for people to interact with a larger system. And that has to be clear. If you don't set these constraints, then people are going to go all over the place. And a design principle is very simple. I spoke about this a couple of times in my presentations because it's super easy to understand. It's not about finding the best technology or like figuring out like, hey, let's try this and this is the best tool, but it's about observing what people are doing already. So let's say you have a team of people, you look at what are they doing and what are the things that they do that you want them to do more of. And then don't think about incentivizing them or giving them money to do these things, because people don't like incentives. If you start a product with incentive design in mind, then you're going the wrong path, because you're basically manipulating people, and at some point people will
That's
notice.
actually one of the most controversial.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the most controversial statements I've ever heard. People don't like incentives. That's like the total, when you think about DAOs for that matter.
Yeah.
I'm so obsessed with this. We have to have the right incentives
Yeah.
for the right work. But here you're like the total opposite of that. People don't like incentives.
Yeah, exactly.
And you, rather than that, you just care about uh, allowing them to do what they want to do more.
Yeah,
Could you get into
exactly,
that more?
exactly. So you can see that on a practical example. Ask yourself if you like the prices in the supermarket increasing. Is that a cool thing? Do you like that? Probably not, but it is an incentive mechanism. It's central banks playing around with the levers that they have in order to steer the economy into the direction that they think is good. It's always good to think about constraints and policy, don't get me wrong. So again, like if you observe what people are doing and you want to let them do more of what they do, you also need to set constraints. You also want to give them some constraints of what they shouldn't be doing, or build a system that doesn't like allow for negative behavior, find bad actors and make sure that they get back on track. But you also don't want to design incentives that will steer the entire system. So we will all, if we do it right, then we will create systems that will help us together design the right constraints. But on a small scale, it's going to be a headache if you're going to try and control everything yourself. Because again, yeah, as you say, you will go back all the time to this question of the incentives aren't right. We need to fix the incentives. We need to do this and give them money here and then give them money there. And then, oh, where does it come from? Okay, so we need to take it away from somewhere. So this is going to be a loop that will never end, and that's just going to keep you centralized. But your goal is to decentralize yourself. So look at what people are doing already. Look what they want to do, and take that as a status quo. And then you find ways to essentially give them ways to do more of that and less of the things that don't benefit the collective.
How do you create that sort of space? Who gets to decide who should do more of what they like and all of that? If you're a decentralized player, who creates that sort of decision making in the first place for that? Those are really interesting questions I would like an answer about.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, it's always you as the individual that designs it. So you'll always have a designer of the organization. You want to have an organization, you also have to design it. You think it's a good idea to have an organization, then you have to think about these things yourself. And then over time, you decentralize this design task, which is essentially just decision making. And what's decision making? It's governance. It's people coming together, discussing stuff, and then agreeing on how they would like to progress. And that is, I think, something we should also focus on when we talk about governance. It's not that we need to give everybody one token and say, hey, now let's vote on this thing, but it's actually conversations and this kind of soft governance that let people come together, make decisions together, and then disperse again. And then you have to slowly find out, how do you decentralize yourself? How do you make sure that more people can participate in the same conversations that you would have with yourself, or like that you wouldn't have with anyone, but where you are a bottleneck, and then design systems around that, and then go on and fractalize that again. Like I can refer to the viable system model as like a way to think about fractalizing these systems, but you'll have to basically look at what's the collective, what's the group, what's the department that makes decisions on this topic, what's this topic and this topic. And then they can have their own sub-departments, and then they can have their own sub-teams. There's a concept from sociocracy, which is basically a kind of a framework for organizations to work, that I think is very helpful for these kinds of organizations. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but yeah, I think that's the trajectory. So you always start centralized because you have the idea, and then over time you just realize that you are the bottleneck. So either you're a freelancer and you're happy with your life, everything's cool, you have these multiple projects that you work on and you progress any way you want, or at some point you gather a critical amount of skills that are extremely important that only you have. So you will need to have more people who you can decentralize to, and then you make decisions together, and then it just spreads open. I think that's how it will always continue. It's a process as well. You never stop.
I get that, the sort of progressive decentralization you advocate. It's been the reason a lot of these major protocols have done a lot of ways. So a lot of DAOs that I've seen personally, when they start off decentralized itself, they don't have a base of culture, they don't have a base of any sort of resources, or a base of actually a track record that they could actually build out of. That's led to a lot of DAOs that I've seen fail. And in that regard, having the sort of space to work out the organizational design, to set in place the right culture and the right soft governance, will actually not 100% success, but at least closer to success than ever possible. And as we get down more thinking about how DAOs should be designed, one of the things that is a constant debate about these DAOs is that, do we have work streams, or do we follow the project-based approach? I think this is something you've been strong in your thesis as well. And what are your thoughts on what's working best? And would love to get into that.
Yeah, thanks. I think in general, what we are aiming for is, by we mean everybody who is working, is something like an agile approach, but not the way that it's implemented in traditional organizations, but more like, if you unimagine contracts and legal responsibilities or obligations, but you just have teams working together on very specific projects with a very clear start date and a very clear retrospective that are relatively short. Because that gives you the ability to be relatively flexible, to either make changes on how you work together, or on like maybe finding some new problems to solve on at the retrospective, or maybe introducing new contributors to the organization, or like to this kind of project workflow, or maybe someone wants to leave. So it gives you a lot of opportunities to be extremely flexible about making decisions in a high frequency, which you don't have if you just assume a work stream and have milestones, and you have a very set team that you pay on a payroll. It's also super expensive, as mentioned before, especially when there is an economic uncertainty about your resources. You can't afford just hiring people with a very high rate and have them on a payroll if you're not sure that they're not going to be able to work, or whether they're going to be able to work all the time, every single day, and also be happy about their work. I think that probably the best approach or way to think about it is as a process of looking at what are your work streams and then making sure that you can projectize those. Again, unimagine it sounds easy to unimagine things, but assume that only freelancers can actually join this work stream, and then projectize it and say, okay, this one project is 2 weeks or 1 week, and depending on how frequently you think you need to check in. And then you look at what's the start date, what's the end date, who are the people who should be there, what should they be doing exactly, what's their workflow, how much are they compensated. And you can use design thinking workshops to actually align on that content as well. Like we do that within 1 or 2 hours, and then pretty much everybody knows exactly what to do and how much they will get paid by the end of the little sprint or the little project. And that way, and even if you still are on a workflow and if you still have payroll, like even defining these things are going to be extremely helpful, because they give everybody the ability to decide on when and how they want to work. And then you can basically transition away from the work stream style and kind of deprecate anything that holds people legally accountable, because they will hold each other socially accountable for the things that they want to do. And then you have these kind of projects, and then you can think back, like how do you repeat, like what's going to be left, what are people still going to want to do, what's going to be there as in terms of the survival of the organization, and how do you put it on a recurring basis. And then you have projects as work streams, if you are concerned about the continuous basis of work. But there's also going to be times where no work is going to be necessary, because just like no work's going to be there, so nobody should do it, and they can focus on other things and find how to contribute in other organizations, get inspired, go see art, go to movies, go to nature, and solve other problems. And then they will bring back the results. And when the work starts again, they'll be a lot more active and creative about the work that they do. This purely project-based approach has really been also a huge contribution to the fast innovation. It's like learning. So like you just shorten down your learning bouts and then you sleep in between.
That's pretty fascinating. I've seen that in a couple of DAOs also, that this whole project-based approach, rather than having this complete full-time thing, it's led to a lot of results also, and the sort of benefits that you kind of advocate for contributors that way. It's pretty effective in that way. But it begs a question. Recently, there was a post by a couple of people who had seen a Reddit post about how Google's engineers, what happens is that when Google launches a couple of products, there is a lot of innovation. The launch goes perfectly and it's all going tip top. But right after the product is launched, people just drift apart. There is no maintenance going on for any of these products, and people just wonder why. But the Reddit post says that it's because the engineers that work on these Google products, they are incentivized to work till the launch the product, and once it's out, they get promoted according to how much the project is launched. And then they had some weird acronym, launch and then forget about it. I'm paraphrasing that. My question is, does this sort of project mentality bring about this sort of mercenary feeling that prioritizes mercenary and project-based thinking rather than a long-term culture that can sustain a community through, in spite of not having projects or things like that? There are a lot of contributors that there are a lot of projects that care about having a sustainable form of funding, and that sense of certainty allows them to drive deep. Those are kind of the key thoughts that Samantha Marin from Aragon DAO really kind of advocates a lot about. What are your thoughts about that?
Really great point. I also saw that tweet or that post. Very interesting. I was aware of that mentality at Google, but I didn't really know that it was that specific, which makes total sense. They're basically being encouraged to do these experiments because they get promoted at any achievement. And so people start just hunting the promotion as part of their resume, as part of a bigger economy where they can show off what they can do as part of earning as much money as possible and so on. I think that in part there is a thing within the project-based approach which also reflects that mentality of you can fail and you can make mistakes, because with the next project you can try again and do better, and you will also receive an attestation for having it completed. So you should definitely be motivated to complete it and to move on with your life to do something that's more interesting. Where we can differ, and this is also something that's been uniquely possible only in Web3, is the ability to distribute ownership of the entire organization to every single participant in the organization. So in the past models, we have equity that can be distributed to very specific people, or shares that can be bought, but they don't really reflect the ownership and contribution of an organization. What DeepWork, for example, is doing with kind of issuing a token for every time someone completes paid work is that each of the roles within the organization has a very particular weight in their organization. And if you complete a project within that role, then you receive a very specific amount of tokens that is relative to the importance of that role to the organization. And that means that the more crucial decisions you make, the more you can participate in decision making with a heavier weight of your token holdings. So our token is a pure governance token, which means you can use it on Snapshot to confirm or to veto, in particular to veto projects or proposals. And we also use it in order to issue a share of calculate how much we can share profit from the profits of particular projects, or like at the end of the month, to the individuals in the community. You don't necessarily need a token for that. You can just put it on a spreadsheet and then say, this is how much money that people have earned in these particular roles. And then let's send them some money from the profits that we've earned. And so that mechanism, this co-ownership, at least this is how we're defining it, but there's many other ways to define ownership that go beyond this model, that basically ties people together for the long term. And I think it's also like maybe another way or like another mental model for these concepts, especially token or financial systems, is not that it encourages or motivates or incentivizes people to do stuff, but see it as if it visualizes what's already there. As a designer or as a financial director or as a founder or creator of an organization, your goal is not to manipulate behaviors and create incentive models, but it's understanding what's going on and visualizing that with numbers. If someone has a high responsibility in the organization, their token holdings should long-term reflect the weight of their influence. And that's what the ownership is about. So you can actually see that on people's token holdings, like I own X tokens, I also make the most decisions, and these decisions have proven to be useful. Whereas someone else might not have a lot of tokens because they just don't contribute that much, but it's also okay because they still have the opportunity to do more.
There's a beautiful point that you mentioned that kind of fills a gap for me, and that is the sort of reputation attestations that could be issued by a certain organization, if done with that sort of value, has the potential to replace legal contracts. The sort of certainty a legal contract can give you is now replaced by the value of the reputation attestation itself. And that, when combined with ownership tokens, goes a long way. I'm stealing this idea for my article. This conversation never happened.
Please do. Fair enough. It's all
and just getting into more aspects of organizational design. How do you a key aspect of what makes a decentralized or a decentralized organization work is the ability to have proper transparency and communicate that accordingly. Sometimes a lot of DAOs fail to communicate that. Maybe they have the right intentions for transparency, but the communication just doesn't follow through. For someone who handles this sort of design, what is your advice for kind of instituting that transparency and communication for teams?
Yeah, I would say that also look at transparency as a tool, not necessarily as a panacea for everything. So transparency is useful when you want to prove to someone, for example, that you have done very specific work. So showing off some previous work that you've done, it's helpful because it gives another person the understanding of what your capabilities are. So show them like your portfolio, your case studies. It's much more relevant than writing a CV about yourself. So sharing a lot of sharing that information is important to be transparent, because if it's not transparent, then to be honest, you also just won't get hired, or it contradicts with the idea of truth. You just like, someone asks you, hey, what can you do? And you're just like, I don't know, maybe hire me first. That's not really truthful, or at least that's not helpful. Transparency is a tool that helps make that connection to prove to someone what your capabilities are. The other important or like helpful area where you can apply transparency is when you want to onboard new people. So you're onboarding new people, new contributors online. You have no idea about what their skills are. You don't know what they'll be able to do, but you don't want to repeat yourself all the time. So I think anytime you have a sense that you're repeating yourself, that is material that deserves to be written down and or somehow solidified. And if someone else already said it, then reference to that particular thing online. And as you do these things, as you create projects and run projects, and you understand that there's some stuff that happens on a recurring basis, that if you were to have to explain to someone what you're doing there, that basically requires transparency and opening up the processes. And that's the point where you should be writing down your exact process of work so that other people can see it. Of course, there are cases where it's not useful to be transparent when you, for example, work for a client that you don't want to disclose to another client because there might be some competitive reasons, or it might actually put you into like your life into danger. So in these cases, it's very important to keep transparency as like also a spectrum, where some things you might want to hide away from very particular people that you don't trust, for example. I don't think that's ever going to disappear. And that's also like one of the areas that Polygon is quite interesting, or like they're working on that. So because there's a lot that can be done with zero knowledge tools, and I think we'll see more and more of that come up. But yeah, that's essentially my take on transparency and why it's important or why not.
No, I feel that it makes sense. Whatever has to be any sort of key processes that kind of happens in work, you have to document that for any other contributor to come in. A lot of the DAOs, what happens is that these key processes just don't get documented, and contributors have to search through the discords, and it just leads to a lot of chaos. In that sense, it makes total sense to follow the tips that you've given them. And coming back to a final question, as a design studio, you've been in the space for quite some time, and now you've seen a lot of service DAOs that are coming up in the space. As WGMI DAOs for CM related services, as Vector DAO for design related services, Llama DAO for treasury management. And further down the road, you will see a lot of these service DAOs pop up in the picture. What are your tips to ensure that they can stay sustainable during these waves of bull and bear markets, and how can they sustain themselves through that? What has worked for DeepWork Studios that way?
Yeah, I think that what I mentioned earlier, just keep highly frequent feedback loops among each other as a community. So tell what you think to people, how they can improve, what are mistakes that they could be making, discuss them, be honest, be open about them, receive feedback. So when someone tells you that work was not sufficient, it doesn't mean that you're fired, because you're still alive, your life is still there, and all that is a valuable bit of information that will help you not do that mistake again. But also do that on an organizational level. So have retrospectives very frequently, once or twice a month. Make sure you keep aligned on what you're doing and why you're doing these things. Focus on the business model. So don't go too far into building stuff because it's cool, because for the most part, as what I'm seeing, is that the revenue streams are usually funded, so VC based or from grants. And that is not a sustainable business model. Nobody will ever give you money forever just for building cool stuff that you think is cool. So switch to the model of generating as much value as possible to as many people as possible, and focus on that, because as long as you can create value, you're going to be alive and you're going to be able to pay your bills, and you can be able to pay for development of cool things. Yeah, there's also a million other things, but I think these people should focus first.
Brilliant. With that, we come to a close. I think this episode, you have a lot of insights that are coming from someone who's been in the game for so long and has done a phenomenal job running his team to a fabulous extent. Andre, thank you so much for coming in and doing this episode with us. It's been a pleasure having your insights over here. Where can people follow you, DeepWork Studios, or any other initiative that you really care about?
Yeah, I have a Twitter. It's Kishiman, KISCHIMAN, and there's DeepWork DeepWork_studio on Twitter. We're not posting that regularly. And then there's a newsletter that I'm currently writing. It's more of an organizational update of what's going on. I do it bi-weekly and post the content and decisions we made in the representative or like the council. And I think these are probably the most important ones. I also have an Instagram, but I don't really use that much.